Hello, and welcome to part 2 of our courageous conversation on how spiritual violence affects LGBTQ people. My name is Beverly Tillery, and I'm the executive director of the New York City Anti-Violence Project. And we are thrilled to be partnering with Trinity Church Wall Street to produce this 2-part panel conversation with you. Please say hi in the public chat and let us know where you're joining us from. You can use the live chat all evening to share your takeaways and questions for tonight's panelists. Please remember that this broadcast and the live chat are public, so the name and picture associated with your account are visible. Also, we may display public comments and questions in the live chat on screen. Hi to Ruth, thanks for joining us. Hi, Joellen, thanks for joining us tonight. During part of the conversation last week, during part 1 of the conversation, we spoke with LGBTQ plus leaders about the impact of spiritual violence against our community. Tonight, we're going to speak with spiritual leaders about how we can change and create safer, more inclusive, and truly affirming spiritual communities for LGBTQ people and all people. In case you missed last week's conversation, and to provide a reminder to those who watched, we have a short recap video to look at. Here it comes.
Spiritual violence is a weapon that attempts to dehumanize queer and trans people through words and actions. Spiritually violent words tell queer people that we are flawed, and specifically flawed in a way that debases God's creation. Spiritually violent actions tell queer people that our lives have no value, so we don't need legal protections, for example, and we don't deserve to be safe on the streets or in our workplaces or even in our own homes. Darlene, where do you see this when someone comes to AVP? Like, where do you see spiritual violence playing out in their lives?
It's so subtle. And oftentimes when we are, talking with someone who's called our hotline, our 24-hour hotline, when we're meeting someone, in person pre-pandemic, folks will share stories with us around the words that have been used, like you're an abomination or you're sinning and you should not be like this, right? And while for us, we may think, oh, that's not subtle at all, but for folks that we're working with or that we've worked with, that they don't always register that as spiritual violence, right? Mm-hmm. Because as queer folks, we're not meant to be spiritual beings or people.
How often do you hear religious language coming up?
Well, I feel like the honest answer to that is every time. If you talk to the people who pass these laws, if you talk to their constituents, the people who vote for these laws, the people who are in favor of them, it is always going to come back to religious language. If it wasn't for this long history of slander and abuse in the form of religious language by mainstream religions against the LGBT community, transphobia and homophobia would not be nearly the problem they are in our society today.
I think that queer identity is itself a spiritual identity. And what I mean by that is queerness is an identity that you discern from within. Like you don't necessarily inherit it from your parents. You have to know it in yourself and be honest about it, even at great cost. To me, that's a spiritual identity. And I think that's why these messages hit us so hard.
That when I, particularly as a Black trans person, talk about my transness, I'm not just talking about my gender, I'm talking about innate rights of being a part of my community and leading people through a process of healing and a spiritual journey, right? And so I think the closer that we are to understanding that, we'll also be at a position to be able to keep people from lying about who queer and trans people are in the world.
And I just want to kind of end by touching on something that May said a minute ago about trans people going through this rebirth and giving birth to ourselves again. And that has been a sentiment that has been really important to me throughout my transition. It was something that kind of hit me early on. And I don't know how else to express it other than you have this whole metaphor of a life and sacrifice and rebirth in the Bible, in Christian mythology. And nobody understands that concept better than trans people.
It strikes me that one of the ways spiritual violence does so much damage is by doing something that I would consider gaslighting. There's also this message that we are, flawed in some way, that we're an affront to God, and that if we don't understand that we're somehow delusional. So like these deep, not like we're told not to believe our deepest parts of our own self.
When I think about like communities of color and how like strong we have to be constantly, because of our intersecting identities, and then adding on a layer of having an LGBTQ identity or gender identity or sexual orientation, and what that means, and how much more you have to fight to exist and to be heard and to be validated, especially as survivors of violence, right? The survivors who come to us, who say to us, this happened to me. Do you believe me?
To me, it could look like, and just to be so bold today, because we having bold dreams, right? I would say like, a lot of times people they ask this question of how do I get more XYZ community to show up at my church, or how do I make it so it's like they can sit in there? It's like instead of thinking about how do I get people to disappear into the dreams of white cis-centered church structures, how do I actually support spiritual workers from targeted communities so they don't have to keep coming into my space, but get to build stuff that's actually been stolen from them?
Hello and welcome. My name is Matt Welsch. My pronouns are he, him, and I am a priest on staff at Trinity Church, Wall Street. But I'm so glad that you have chosen to join us for this very important conversation. As a gay priest, I believe strongly that queerness is a gift, and all people in all our wild diversity are made in the image of God and therefore deserving of dignity and love. And yet, as we know in our bones, and as we just heard again, right, so often our religious traditions, which should be havens of health and support, are often weaponized against LGBTQ plus folks, especially LGBTQ plus youth. Here at Trinity, I work directly with young people along with an incredible team of youth staff and volunteers who work hard to ensure that all of our youth can be themselves, be exactly the person they were created to be in a spiritually safe and supportive environment. And yet, we are deeply aware that this issue of spiritual violence and the trauma that it causes in the lives of queer folk is always present, sort of right beneath the surface. And that we as people, as leaders in their lives, have an obligation to create a space for healing. In last week's conversation, we focused on what spiritual violence is and why it hits queer souls so hard. This week, we will be focusing on what faith communities can do about it. As you saw in the video, we have a lot to unpack here today with our faith leader panel. And I would like to remind you that we will have time to take questions from you, the audience, at the end of our program. Please go ahead and put your questions in the live chat. And now I'm thrilled to introduce our amazing panel. The Reverend Elizabeth Edman is an Episcopal priest and queer theologian. She's the author of Queer Virtue, What LGBTQ People Know About Life and Love, and How It Can Revitalize Christianity. She was also our moderator for last week's conversation. The Reverend Kyndra Frazier is a Baptist clergywoman, a licensed clinician, and the founder and CEO of Kind, Knowing Yourself in Need of Devotion Consulting. She was the founding executive director of the Hope Center, a free mental health facility located in Harlem. Among its many services, Hope works to address spiritual wounds sustained by LGBTQ people of color. Rabbi Marisa Elana James is Director of Social Justice Programming at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, a proudly LGBTQ synagogue in New York City. CBST champions a Judaism that rejoices in diversity, denounces spiritual injustice wherever it exists, and strives for human rights for all people. And the Reverend Clint Schneckloth is the pastor at Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Fayetteville, Arkansas. In direct response to anti-trans legislation that passed in Arkansas this past spring, Clint's church organized Queer Camp, a church camp for queer kids and adults. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. We've got a great panel, and let's get started. So, Liz, you moderated last week's conversation, and so I'd like to start with you here. Based on what you heard, why should faith communities care about this issue?
Thanks, Matt. I'm really happy to be here and happy to see all the folks from all over the world who are gathered with us today, this evening. I'm in addition to being a priest and author and all that, I am also on the board of the Anti-Violence Project. And this conversation is born largely of AVP hearing about spiritual violence against people who come in to see us. And we heard some of that last week from Darlene Torres. So I sort of heard four big things going on that I think faith communities should care about. And one is the fact that that spiritual violence causes a tremendous amount of pain in people's lives, as AVP attests. And, for faith communities, addressing suffering in the world is supposed to be our stock in trade. That's what we're supposed to do. So that's one thing, is there's this situation here, it needs to be addressed. We're the ones who are supposed to do that. We heard last week, and it was in the recap video as well, that one of the real challenges with spiritual violence is that it gaslights people. That one of the methodologies of spiritual violence is that it causes queer people to distrust our inner knowledge. And, you can't have a healthy spiritual life if you don't trust what you know fundamentally to be true. Again, for faith communities, helping people build a solid foundation for a healthy spiritual life, that's our stock in trade too. So we should care about it for that reason. But, I don't want to sit here and pretend that our interest in this is all, it's pastoral, we should be concerned about those queers over there because they're hurting and that's our job. That's true. But faith communities should understand that we have skin in this game. Spiritual violence doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from our traditions, and we heard that loud and clear last week, the deep awareness that faith communities are responsible for the violence that is perpetrated against LGBTQ people. Now, maybe not every single one of us has done that. Maybe not every single one of us believes. I know for a fact many of us do not believe in that, but people within our communities have warped our teachings to do terrible harm. And there's a sense in which we created this problem. It's on us to fix it. And that's and it matters really here to understand, because this is something else that we heard clearly last week. Our credibility is at stake here. There are many, many, many LGBTQ people who long ago left faith communities because they knew it wasn't safe, and they stopped believing what's being taught and preached in those communities. But it's not just queer people who have that sense that something has gone awry. Growing numbers of people of all persuasions know that these hateful teachings are false and not true to our traditions. So it's fair for people to ask us, Do we actually speak truth to the real world or not?
Thank you, Liz. Clint, Liz raises this issue, right, of credibility for faith communities, and that it is so important for us to play a role in essentially fixing this problem that we have created, and that many people recognize that our stance on LGBTQ justice signals how much they can trust us. Your church is located in a university town in the middle of the Bible Belt. How does the credibility issue affect your work?
Well, one of the things that happens in my part of the world that may be strange to those of you that live like on the East Coast is people actually might start a conversation with new people that they've met, asking them whether they've found a church home yet. You know, so like rather than where do you work or where are you from or something like that, that starts the conversation. And it's a cultural thing, but it's also part of the kind of this base evangelical, or I guess you would almost want to say colonial mindset that Christianity has had that's been so damaging in so many ways, even beyond this particular topic about spiritual violence within LGBT communities. Like, for example, today is Orange T-shirt Day because of the harm Christians have done to the indigenous communities in the United States through the same kind of like proselytization and colonization. And so what's happening there is that Christians are starting from the assumption that they need to help somebody navigate into their way of being a Christian. I remember this was a topic last week too, and I totally agree with this. Like my job, and this is getting to the credibility piece, my job is not to try to convince you that you need to come be with me in the space that's safe for me as a, you know, white cis hetero man. My job is to figure out how to align with you to help make sure that you're thriving in your context and I'm thriving in mine, much more of like a mutual model. And I think that increasingly people in our neighbors and really the whole world are clued into the ways in which Christianity has been colonial, and they're not buying it anymore. And so we look bad when we're starting from that kind of paternalistic posture of I have something to give or do for you. And we do a lot better job of representing what I would consider to be authentic Christianity anyway, when we start focusing on like place sharing, you know, that I empty myself, make myself vulnerable, come to where you are, and then we work on this together. And I think that's something I try to practice within my own faith community so that I can hopefully kind of evacuate the way that historically the tradition in which I was raised has started from this posture of we have something to give you because you're so lost.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chris. Kyndra, you specialize in trauma-informed care, and you have trained faith communities in how to address trauma. As we reflect on spiritual violence and the wide-ranging impact that it has, I'm wondering, right, when it comes to healing the wounds of spiritual violence and religious trauma, how equipped are faith communities to do this work? And how can they ramp up their skills?
That's a great question, Matt, and I am so grateful to be on with all the brilliant minds here today. The work that I have been doing around trauma-informed support for ecclesial communities has made me realize even more how much the work is needed. I've found that particularly in churches of color, specifically Black churches that I work with, there's a way that we have normalized trauma in general. And we pick up this idea that we just have to continue to push through the atrocities that we've experienced. And I've had to shift the way that I integrate talking about spiritual violence as it relates to LGBTQ people. I have had to start out with supporting people in engaging in how trauma shows up in their own lives, how it shows up in their bodies. Because I don't think that, for me, what I've learned, that teaching what happens to LGBTQ people first, there's a disconnection because people start believing that, oh, just something out there, right? They don't recognize that the trauma that they infringe upon LGBTQ folks, they've already done to themselves. The theological violence has already been done to them, because we come in my working definition of trauma, because I want to make trauma really accessible for everybody, is that trauma is anything that disrupts our sense of belonging to ourselves and to the community. When I came into Christianity, there was already this sense that I did not belong. That's the only reason why I chose to get saved, as they would teach me in my own Christian tradition that I needed to accept Christ, because there was something about me that did not belong. And that's how I like to start out when I'm working with churches specifically, is that our whole theological framework and how Christianity, particularly white supremacist Christianity, is formed is around a sense of not belonging. And so we all can meet and join there. And then when it comes to how spiritual violence is perpetuated towards LGBTQ folks, it is another layer of these people who are within the LGBT community having the audacity to name themselves as belonging, because it is informed, as Liz said, from within them. There is nothing that we go to that makes us say, this is where we're supposed to be. This is a journey that many of us have taken in and of ourselves, where we did not have community to validate that we belong. So I think where churches can start at is first looking at the signs and symptoms of trauma, how it shows up in our own family systems, how we bring the trauma responses and retentions that we have into our relationships. And then from there, we can start working out into the micro experience of the institution of the church and how we perpetuate the violence within LGBTQ folks. I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think the definition of trauma is something that disrupts our sense of ourselves and our community. That is such a succinct definition of trauma, and I appreciate it. And yeah, Marisa, CBST is considered by many to be the unofficial spiritual home of the LGBTQ community in New York. The synagogue is also quite active on other social justice fronts, your immigration clinic, Jewish-Muslim relations, and so on. What is the relationship between all of this justice and relationship building work and healing the spiritual wounds of LGBTQ folks?
Oh, those questions are so deeply linked in our community. Our synagogue was founded in the 70s by a group of gay Jewish men who could not find a home, a spiritual home. In the 70s, of course, most religious communities, if you could either be showing up as your religious self or as your self and your full sexuality and gender identity, but usually not both. So CBST was founded by people who understood that there was a breach in the community and the broader Jewish community that was not going to be healed by the broader Jewish community. And so they started their own. And since that beginning, there has been this deep sense of looking to see, well, who else is missing from this conversation? Who else is missing from this prayer? Who else is missing from the way that we are blessing each other and we are being blessed by? So showing up for immigrants, showing up for our Muslim neighbors, showing up for anyone else who is under attack in any way. We also have an ending mass incarceration team. We have a democracy team also under attack. Being aware of what's missing. And we talk a lot in religious communities that are the Abrahamic faiths that sort of launch out of the Bible, about, as you mentioned at the beginning, Matt, about people being created in God's image. But I like to teach the reverse of that, and I started this with teaching sixth graders, that if you want to have a conception of God, I mean, flip this the other way around. If you want to know who God is, well, if we're created in the image of the divine, then the best way that you can possibly begin to understand who God is by looking at every single person you encounter, seeing the fullness of who that person is, listening to who they are, and understanding that each person who you truly see and respect and take in has given you a new piece of being able to understand the divine. So it's actually feels like, for me, it's necessary theologically to be interacting with each other, to be valuing each other, to be loving each other, and to be understanding that right, God doesn't make mistakes. Right? I'm queer because God wanted me to be queer, and that's amazing. And why would I want to be in a community that wasn't going to celebrate that? So, one of the ways that's reflected even in the services that we do, in our religious services, and something that has spoken to a lot of people who are not Jewish, who have come to us, is the idea that we are blessing specifically the experiences of queer people. We are blessing specifically the identities of queer people in our most public and our most sacred moments. In the synagogues where I grew up, which were much more conservative, which were much more hesitant to change, it would be kind of a radical thing to say, well, could I bring my partner up to the bima, to the dais with me? Trying to translate myself as I go. Right, that would be confusing to people. Like, well, there'd be a conversation. Can we do that? Is that okay? Is that holy enough to be present here? And so, a spiritual leader in that kind of a context might think, oh, well, I'm trying to figure out the right way to do this. But what they don't realize is that in the process, they're communicating both to the queer person and to the entire community that something that is holy, something that is part of somebody's connection to their community and themselves, thank you for that, when you are heterosexual, when you are cisgendered, that the minute you're queer, those things are questions. They're not just understood to be part of religious life, that you would show up with your partner, that a couple with a new baby would get blessed, that all of a sudden it's a question. Oh, well, can we do that? Is that okay? And so one of the things that CBST has modeled, and it's been really wonderful to see how many rabbinical students have come through our doors as interns and are now out in the world as rabbis across the country in different roles, is this understanding that if you just, it's not a question, you don't treat people as questions, you don't treat people's lives and their connections to God as a question, you treat them as something to be blessed, you treat them as something holy, as a necessary piece of your spiritual community. And that's actually the best teaching that you can do for a community, is simply to model, yes, every single one of these human beings is holy, is worth celebrating, and is deserving of being recognized as that spark of the divine.
Thank you, Marisa. My husband Joel is Jewish, and we like to joke that our wedding was a traditional gay interfaith military ceremony, which is sort of all of these things, right, can intersect. This is it's a part of who we are as individuals and as a couple, and that's true for all people, right? And we all are complicated sort of constellations of identities that all intersect, and that's challenging for so many religious institutions who kind of want things to sort of line up into sort of a neat box. And Clint, sort of along those lines, right? You were talking about the ways that Christianity or a particular view of Christianity is kind of baked into the culture in your part of the country, in your neck of the woods in Arkansas. And last week, Lisa told us about the relationships that have been forged between progressive faith leaders and queer and trans activists in Northwest Arkansas. Why are these relationships important to you? And how have they informed your church's work?
So here's a great example. one of my favorite stories at the beginning of our launching of Queer Camp. So we have a faith community that is not exclusively LGBTQ, but a significant percentage of the membership of our congregation is a part of the queer community. But the person who initially moved the idea forward for a queer camp is a straight white guy, me. One of the things that I know that I need to do in order to make sure that that's not a terrible idea is make sure that the community that it's about and for is that's something that would be of value to them. And so my job as an ally or however you want to think about that is to make sure that I check in that way. So we got this group together to start talking about whether we would move forward with the camp. And a friend of mine who is trans and not a part of any Christian community came to our meeting and was really upfront. She showed up and she said, basically, I'm here because I want to make sure that this isn't a terrible idea. And I'm going to tell you whether this is a bad idea or a good idea, basically. So she was watching out for us. You know what I mean? She's going to tell us, is it a good idea for a church to have a queer camp or not? And there's a level of trust there. There's a level of relationship that's been built that if we hadn't have built those relationships before we came up with the idea, we might have run off and done things that were that we thought were good, but weren't necessarily what the community that it was for really identified with or aligned with. So I think that those kinds of friendships and relationships kind of fund that back and forth. And I've always kind of, especially in the last, I don't know how many years, have tried to increasingly kind of learn from the insight that I got from Liz Edman's book and other places, that there are literally virtues within the queer community that the church needs to hear, that Christians need to hear in order to be the church or to be Christian better.
Mm-hmm. And that is a perfect little segue there, Clint, because Liz, I understand that you went down to Arkansas for Queer Camp. And so I'm wondering, right, did you learn anything about the spiritual wounds of the campers while you were there? What was that like?
The truth is, one of the things that I learned is that the wounds are even greater than I would have thought, honestly. I've been around for a while, and I'm one of those people who would think, oh, it's probably so much better for queer kids now than it was when I was growing up. And in some ways it is. But Clint, I'm going to ask you about this in a second here. Clint was unsure whether to bring spiritual content to these kids or not. And and that made me think, wow, why are they what are these wounds that they're that bad that at a church camp they're hands off on theology or spiritual messaging, right? So I started talking to some folks, and one of the things that a person I asked about this, who was from a rural area outside of Fayetteville, she speculated that you've got evangelical culture that's now wedded to gun culture. And that makes life far more dangerous for a lot of kids. That you may have kids that once upon a time, their families might have thrown them out of the house, which would be horrible. But now there are kids and their dad might come after them with a gun. Now, I've been asking folks at AVP, can we actually document this? And we don't collect that kind of information, even though we've got a national coalition of anti-violence projects. We know that gun violence is the leading cause of violence. But in any case, there's something really toxic at work right now and really dangerous for kids. One of the things that Lisa said, just as Clint was just saying, is that within the queer and trans community in Northwest Arkansas, when Clint announced this camp, there were people who thought, is this a trap? So we've got a situation where the wounds are so great that it can be challenging for queer people to access content at all that is spiritual because there's so much fear of whether it's real, whether it will it heal me or will it hurt me more? And that's an insidious cycle. You know, that's another way I think that spiritual violence has done tremendous damage to people. So Clint, I'm wondering if you can say a few words, because you started out thinking we're not doing any spiritual thing, and then you changed your mind enough at least to let me come down there. like how did that, tell us about that?
Well, what the campers told us was, you know, one of the barriers was basically just even coming onto the church grounds or crossing the threshold of the building at all. Many of them had such terrible experiences when they came out or whatever, that they weren't sure they were ever going to, you know, even enter a church building in the future. And so even though the camp wasn't like specifically Lutheran or Christian, and it was more of like a secularly formatted camp, even that was still almost too much for some people. And we even had campers and even a couple staff who, you know, after the camp, they came up to us and they said, even the third or fourth day, I was still thinking, like, when's the other shoe going to drop? You know, when is there going to be some lecture or some talk that we were all tricked into. So for me, not starting with the spirituality thing it's almost like you think about in curriculum development, they talk about like the overt curriculum and then like the null curriculum. And the best way to have the best null curriculum for this camp was to not have the overt curriculum, because then people could see that we could actually create a space that centered them and their experience. And if spiritual topics came up, it came up organically because the campers and the staff that were a part of the week just kind of brought it up, you know, more informally within the spaces where they were gathering.
One of the things that you did with that too, you know, you and I had that wonderful conversation over dinner, you know, where you introduced them to the idea that there is content out there that is not just queer affirming, but there's religious content that is actually queer, that is itself queer, you know. And I think you did something really important there to make that accessible to them. You know, let them know that exists. And, you know, that you'd been going for a couple of days at that point. And I think you kind of endorsing that, let them know it was safe for me to show up and have that conversation, which I think is something really important that faith leaders could be incredibly proactive about, that might help begin to break that insidious cycle.
Mm-hmm. And of course we run the risk as faith leaders and as members of faith communities. We run the risk if we hide ourselves of actually unintentionally causing more damage, right? Because we either are perpetuating this idea that there's something that we're not saying, that it may in fact be a trap, or we're saying, as one of my colleagues likes to say, right, we're giving the false impression that you're not good enough for the real stuff, right, which is also not what we want to be doing at all.
Well, and I think honestly that there's that we run the risk of them thinking you're just being nice to me. You really do believe all that stuff. You're just being nice to me, you know. Right,
that this is an exception rather than an actual active expression of what we believe at the core of our being. And Kyndra, I want to bring you into this discussion here, because this is a really important and vexing issue, right? That spiritual violence and the nature of it can make it hard for queer people to engage in religion or spiritual healing at all. How can we address this?
That's a great question, Matt. You said a perfect word a couple of seconds ago. You talked about hiding. I believe that queer people want spaces where they don't have to hide, and spaces that don't practice a culture of hiding. What I've found in many church spaces that I didn't know before going into a pastorate position was that many people talk a particular theological understanding of integrity in the pulpit, but it is often not practiced behind closed doors. I've been looking at some of the comments. I've found that we have created this space of not being honest about what our struggles are, not being honest about what our desires are, not being honest about where the pain is. And I believe that spaces have to be created for queer folks that allow them to explore the expansiveness of their divinity. And I think that is really for all of us. I think of virtual faith communities like Pink Robe Chronicles, started by Reverend Dr. Melva Sampson, who's the assistant professor of preaching and practical theology. Now, Melva is a cisgender woman, but I identify Melva as queer because of the way that she engages people to really step into their own knowingness, their own divining of self when it comes to creating space for folks to really figure out how they intersect with God. How do they intersect with their own understanding of being made in the image and likeness of God? I think of spaces like The Proverbial Experience by Levon Proverbs, where she welcomes people into spiritual gatherings, where she's talking about ancestral veneration, where she is centering her understanding in African traditional ways of knowing. I think that other sacred texts have to be included also, in addition to biblical texts, because I don't believe that God can be canonized. I believe that there's so many other texts, and we are walking, living sacred texts that we can pull from. And I think that we need to be honored in that way. And so the list could go on in terms of what I feel like queer folks need. I'm thinking about my sister friend, Estinina Dillard, who is an ordained Presbyterian minister as well as priestess in the Orisha tradition. And she offers spiritual counseling. She's a sexologist as well. She offers ancestral readings, tarot card readings, because people are looking for different ways to access the divinity within them. And we have to be able to offer additional avenues for knowing, even in the midst of faith spaces.
God cannot be canonized. I want that on a t-shirt. I want it on a print. I want it on a mug. I want it on everything. I'll be sure to credit you. It'll be great. We've got a whole system.
Thanks, Matt.
And to that point about God speaks to us in so many ways, right? So many ways, and we can't limit God in that way. And Marisa, I'm aware that CBST draws folks from all kinds of places, right? Every denomination in Judaism and other faith traditions and no faith tradition at all, right? How do you bring them in, and how does that impact your understanding of dealing with spiritual wounds?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it would be very challenging to try to create something that spoke to every single person who walked in the door. But I think what we have done is create something that is deeply and fully and beautifully Jewish, and deeply and fully and beautifully, loving of every human being who walks in our door. And some people find things that they, in the prayers, in whatever, that they just feel like it calls to them. And that's wonderful. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who walk in who are like, this isn't exactly my theology, but how wonderful it is to be valued. And so, I think there's a challenge when people feel like, especially like in interfaith contexts or in a context where they know there's a lot of multi-faith folks coming in, that they feel, well, we have to put in something from this tradition, or we have to include something from this tradition. And I think we've gone the route of being deeply authentic to what our community is and who we are as a Jewish community that is not in one particular denomination. And knowing that it's not going to be the right place spiritually, theologically for everyone, but that everyone who walks in is going to understand how much they are valued being in that room. One thing I learned when I was working with small children, and repetition is such a wonderful tool of learning, but I would say to every single small child who walked in the room, I'm so glad you're here. And I feel like in a way that's the ideal for any community, and especially for religious community. We might not be saying those words exactly, but to be encountering every human being with this deep attitude of, I'm so glad you are here. Because that's something that, I know as someone who has walked into other religious spaces where it's clear that not everybody is very glad that I'm there, right? You feel that, you can feel the difference. So I think that's one of the reasons, we've had, when we were still in person, one of my favorite moments on Friday nights was when whoever was leading services, usually our senior rabbi, Rabbi Kleinbaum, would look around the room and say, if it's your first time here, we want to know who you are and where you're joining us from. And I wouldn't say it was a typical night, but I do remember we always had people from all over the place who were like, we've heard special things about this place. We wanted to come here and see why people tell us about this. And it was not an uncommon night for people to be like, oh, okay, I'm here from Florida. I'm here from Canada. I'm here from Australia. I'm here from Saudi Arabia. I'm here from Guatemala. And it was like, it's not, Liz is nodding, Liz knows, right? Not unusual, because, friends from different religious communities would just be like, but wait, I want to see what this is, this feeling of being absolutely every atom of my being welcome in a space, and loved and valued and treasured and blessed in a space, even if that tradition is not mine. And I hope that people who come for whom it's not exactly their tradition, or it's not the tradition that calls to them, that at least that lesson is the thing, and that feeling is the thing that they take out into the world with them.
Thank you, Marisa. We've got some questions coming in from the audience, and I think that that Jen is asking a question that relates directly to this conversation this conversation we're having right now, and I think it also relates, Liz, to work that you are doing with St. Lydia's Dinner Church in Brooklyn. I'm guessing the Holy Spirit is gonna help us out here. But you're doing a series on queer church and queer Christianity. And I'm wondering if that might speak at all to this question that Jen asks, when met with a lot of spiritually violent conservative views, how do we remain resilient and affirming of our queer selves, our spirituality, faith, our own authentic truth? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I sure do. Jen, thank you so much for that question. There's so it's St. Lydia's, which is my church, my dinner church, and we've got this series right now on queer church, queer Christianity. And what's fascinating about it is that we're now taking this concept of queerness, and it's not necessarily about LGBTQ sexuality. I mean, it's connected, but that's part of the conversation that we're having, because queerness is about disrupting false binaries. It's about disrupting energy that is, rigid thinking that pits us against each other, and we call it queerness because that's what queer identity is all about. I was talking about faith community stock in trade. Disrupting false binaries is queer people stock in trade. That's what we do. We know so much about it. So in this way that so many people have given voice to, this is one of the ways that queer people actually possess authority that should matter to faith communities. So Jen, that's one of the things that I think is so important for queer people to do, is to be aware of these impulses that we carry around in the fiber of our being, and consciously cultivate a sense of the value of that, the moral caliber that exists inside of that. And you have to name that for yourself and claim it, talk with other people about it. Whenever faith communities are doing this work, just be in touch with the levels of what you know inside yourself and in queer community broadly. This is not an individual thing. This is something we know as community. And that's one of the most important ways I think that we can hang on to ourselves and hang on to our knowledge that we are valuable, that our queerness is valuable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When we know that often that churches and other faith communities might say that they are LGBTQ affirming and yet sort of fall short of that claim, and we've got a couple of questions here about sort of how to navigate that. And in particular, Clint, I'd like to ask you if you might want to reflect on Bev's question here, which is if you are part of an anti-LGBTQ faith community, but you want to be a queer ally, what can you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to trouble the waters. I think that one of the biggest problems we have right now in terms of the Christian church really grappling with this issue, and really all faith communities grappling with this issue, is that people have placed centrism or holding everything together over the lives of queer people. You know, so it's a higher priority to keep members or to keep things calm, and that's a big problem. You know, it's that false peace that you read about, like in scripture in so many different places. And I love what Marisa talked about, because this is core to me, and the way she described it is really solid. You know, that when people show up in her faith community space, they feel like every part of who they are is affirmed in that space. And there's a lot of churches who will say we're welcoming, but what they really mean is we'll kind of accommodate some parts of who you are, and you can actually come into the building, you know, but then there's going to be a set of rules that come along. So there's all these guardrails, and the people are walking in as a walking question, like you said. There's a huge difference between being welcoming and creating space that's designed specifically for the people who are there with them in mind. And so, like, the beginning of Queer Camp was a super example of this. We had kids who showed up on our church grounds on that Monday evening, and they just started kind of like walking around in awe because other kids had shown up looking like their queer selves. And so, like, a couple of them came up to me and they were like, there are so many cool kids here, I don't know where to start meeting them. You know what I mean? Like, because, and I don't know, this is probably a big difference between like Arkansas and New York. You guys forget that you all live on top of each other over there when we don't live on top of each other over here. So we had kids that like drove in from like Paris, Arkansas, or just rural Arkansas, and they literally they've never met in their entire life anybody who is identified as queer, and they identify as queer. And so here they are in this community where there's 90 kids who identify as queer, and they're like literally just like blown away to be in that space. So to answer your question about the allies, if you really want to be an ally, you probably need to disrupt the spaces you're in. And you need to start making safe spaces where kids like the ones that came from Paris, Arkansas, feel like they're totally affirmed in who they are.
Thank you, Clint. Thank you, Clint. It looks like we have time for one last question from the audience. I feel like we could talk for hours and hours and hours, but I want to be mindful of the time. Liz, we have a question from the audience, which is, do any affirming faith communities have ways for people to report spiritual violence like we might expect employers to have? Do you know of anything along those lines?
I am not aware of anything along those lines. It strikes me that if a faith community cultivated an awareness of spiritual violence as a phenomenon, it would not be difficult to send the message to folks, if you have experienced this, there's somebody you can come talk to, or we're going to create a community around that. But I also want to, I want to be just a little careful here in sort of the idea of reporting, in the sense of, because I want to come around this real quickly. Matt, you used the word hiding. Kyndra picked up on that to talk about the ways that in faith communities, lots of people hide lots of the time, which is why I think when Marisa says CBST is just itself, and I do know this personally, that CBST tells the truth, starting with CBST is true to its own identity. And I think what that means is somebody who walks in the door at CBST, you feel the authenticity of that community. And I'm not just talking about the ways that it's LGBTQ. I'm talking about a place where people routinely tell the truth about all kinds of things, about stuff that's hard in the world, about stuff that's hard in Judaism, about, telling real stories and then owning, this is who we are. What that means is that when the rabbis on the bima communicate to people in the congregation, you are valued and loved, people in the congregation can take that in and believe it. Because everything you hear from that bima is honest. And so that's one of the things that I would really encourage faith communities to grapple with here, is the burden on us, and I mean each of us, anybody in a faith community, the burden on us to tell the truth in our community, to grapple with conflict honestly, to get it out and really, take seriously the truth that we speak.
Thank you, Liz. Marisa,
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that, because I think what Liz said about the concept of reporting it, right? Like, it's important for people to know in a community if someone is experiencing something that is spiritually violent to who they are. And it's a big difference when you have that happening from the leadership versus if you have a community where, look, like a lot of religious communities, people bring their trauma to their religious communities, and people come with all different kinds of backgrounds, all different kinds of hurt, all different kinds of trauma. And no religious community is a perfect space where people are not accidentally or on purpose inflicting their trauma on each other. And so I just know from long experience that one of the challenges of being in a community where so many people are carrying pain with them, so many people are carrying baggage that's like basically steamer trunks, is that, you need to ask people if they're having a good experience. You need to actually engage with people directly to find out, because it may be that from what they're hearing from above is actually fantastic, but it may be that they heard somebody sitting next to them, right? It's not unheard of in the gay community to have people be super transphobic. It's not unheard of in LGBTQ white community to be like really racist, right? So there's always these different intersectional moments of how we're listening and making sure that we're interacting with people in the community so that they're not reproducing harm, that they're not, having their own trauma then spill out onto somebody else. And so I think instead of the word reporting, I would say in an affirming community, to have the kind of relationship with spiritual leadership that you feel like you can say, you know what, I'd love to have a conversation. There was something that happened the other day that was incredibly hurtful. And whether that came from leadership, whether that came from someone sitting behind you in the pews, doesn't matter. The question is that every community is always a work in progress, that we are always, you cannot live on the planet as a human being without causing some kind of harm, but the work is to recognize it, to grow past it, to fix the harm that one has done as much as is possible, and to build communities where that work is really honestly possible.
Thanks so much, Marisa. And that ties in so beautifully, Kyndra, with your working definition of trauma and the way that it disrupts our sense of self and our communities. And I wonder if you might want to jump in there with a last thought here as we're looking at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to end with this quote by Sobonfu Somé, who is from the Dagara tribe. She has since transitioned, but she has this beautiful way of naming what they identify gay people as in their community. She says they are the special ones. They are the gatekeepers. Without them, nothing can happen. They are the gatekeepers, and without them, nothing can happen. I believe when we can do the work of uncovering why there is so much vitriol and queerphobic rhetoric within our churches, we can begin to expand even more what liberation looks like for all of us who are still trying to grapple with and understand how we show up fully in our humanity, particularly because in so many spaces, not just in the church, we practice a level of hiding that disconnects us again from our sense of belonging to ourselves and the communities that we desire to be in relationship with. And so that is my offering.
Beautiful, beautiful. That quote is another incredible quote. Could you actually say that quote again? Could you say it
Absolutely.
again?
So Bonfu Somé says, we don't call them gay. They are the special ones. They are the gatekeepers. Without them, nothing can happen.
Yeah, that's hitting me in, and we'll talk about that later. And I feel like this conversation could just go on and on and on.
Absolutely.
And indeed it should. Right. And yet in this particular phase of the conversation, right, we need to come to an end here. The good news is that the conversation will continue with our next steps discussion, which will take place on Tuesday, October 19th, from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern on Zoom. And the Reverend Liz Edman will host this conversation as an interactive working conversation with some of the panelists from these September events. You can join us to ask questions and discuss ideas for addressing spiritual violence in your particular context. So all are welcome to these conversations, queer or non-queer, clergy and lay leaders, members of faith communities, and those unaffiliated with a community, gatekeepers and not gatekeepers, people of any faith and of no faith. But just please make sure that you register at www.queervirtue.com. And if you missed last week's conversation or want to see it again, please visit avp.org/spiritual violence. That's avp.org/spiritual violence, or trinitywallstreet.org/courageous. And we've put the links in the chat for you too. Everyone here at Trinity Wall Street would like to thank the Anti-Violence Project and say a major thank you, especially to all of our wonderful panelists. Thank you all for this incredible conversation. And thank you for joining this courageous conversation, all of you who joined in the audience. And have a good night.